here.
What, like screenings and stuff?
Screenings, panels, it depends on, you know, anyway, people are entering.
My gosh. All right. Okay, well, hopefully, oh, that's nice. Participant count. Okay.
If you're here for the hashtag Stop Asian Hate panel, you are in the right place. We're just allowing folks to enter for another 30 seconds or so, and then we'll get started. Thank you.
Okay.
Okay, welcome to the Writers Guild of America East's hashtag Stop Asian Hate panel. We thought it was very important to bring you this panel this week. Thank you for joining us. To host tonight's panel, we have WGA East Council member Lisa Takeuchi Cullen here. She will be talking with a panel representing all areas that the Writers Guild of America East represents. Thank you to our panelists for being here, and thank you for Lisa for moderating tonight. Take it away.
Hi, everybody. Thank you very much for joining us tonight for this important discussion. I am Lisa Takeuchi Cullen. I am a member of the WGA East Council. I am also co-chair of our Committee for Inclusion and Equity and co-founder of our Asian American Salon. For our live audience, if you have questions that you want me to ask our guests, please use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your Zoom screen, and we will review the questions and we'll try to get to all of them at the end of the program. Before we begin, I wanted to read the statement that we at the WGA East put together and released on the topic. We, the Writers Guild of America East, stand with our AAPI screenwriter and journalist members against the latest wave of hate crimes against Asians across this country. As members, we recognize that we can play a key role in changing misperceptions about Asian Americans, and we take that responsibility seriously. Within our guild, our Asian American Salon meets regularly to showcase, unite, and provide a community for our Asian American TV and screenwriter members. A year ago, we kicked off the Asian American Writers of Entertainment for East Coast-based AAPI members and non-members who work in and around the business. Our journalist members, including those at Gimlet, Slate, and HuffPost, are pushing anti-racism agendas in their employment contracts. But we can all do more. As writers of television, film, broadcast news, and digital news, we pledge to do better by A, uplifting our Asian American writer members and their voices, B, giving careful consideration to our portrayal of fictional characters of Asian descent, and C, covering their communities fairly, accurately, and prominently. There is no place for racism in the media or in our country. You'll find this statement on our website, wgaeast.org, as well as links to resources and ways to help. So I'd now like to introduce you to our guests. As you may know, and as Dana just said, the WGA East represents a number of constituencies, including TV writers, screenwriters, TV broadcast news writers, and digital news writers. And we have members from each sector here tonight to talk about how we as writers can play a role in changing perceptions of Asians. First, we have Albert Kim. He is a TV writer and producer and showrunner who has worked on shows including Sleepy Hollow, Nikita, Pantheon, Leverage, and Dirt. He is currently creating and running a yet to be announced and highly anticipated show for Netflix, which he may or may not share about tonight. Prior to TV writing, Albert was an award-winning journalist. This is actually how we met back in the old Time Life building. He has written and edited for Sports Illustrated, Entertainment Weekly, People, and Esquire, and he co-created the program ESPN Hollywood. Next, we have my friend and compatriot, Derek Nguyen, screenwriter, director, producer, and co-founder of The Population, a filmmaker-driven company focused on producing work featuring underrepresented voices. His work includes The Housemaid, set in his native Vietnam, and an American adaptation of The Housemaid called Grave Hill, which is currently in production. Derek?
Soon to be in production.
Soon to be in production. He's produced many films focusing on works by underrepresented storytellers. Derek is on the WGA East's Committee for Inclusion and Equity and is my co-founder and co-chair of the Asian American Salon. We also have Cecilia Wong. She is a news producer at WCBS TV in New York. Cecilia previously worked at stations in Santa Barbara, Sacramento, and the Bay Area, areas where, as we know, a lot of these hate crimes have taken place, so we can talk about those. Cecilia started in print journalism before kicking off her broadcast career at Dateline NBC. She grew up in Atlanta, went to high school in LA, and attended UC Berkeley. Cecilia is a new member, right, of the WGA East, and get ready because we look forward to roping you into many more activities. And last but not least, we have Marina Fang, a national reporter at HuffPost. She covers the intersection of culture and politics, including diversity and representation in race and gender, issues surrounding Asian American identity, as well as movies and television. She previously covered national politics and was very involved in overseeing HuffPost's coverage of the 2016 election, which went very smoothly, I hear. She's from Pittsburgh and is a graduate of the University of Chicago. Marina is active on HuffPost's Union Committee and the WGA East's Digital Media Industry-Wide Committee. So welcome to everybody, and thank you all for being here during this fraught time. I guess my first question is, how are we holding up? Starting with you, Albert, you have a family, a wife and kids. What's it like for you guys right now?
It's been an interesting week. You know, in one sense, being quarantined, you know, we still are in our bubbles. So there's not a lot of contact with the outside world, at least physically. So we had to resort, as everyone does, to living online. And it's been really interesting watching things appear online, even just sort of monitoring social media feeds, which I don't tend to do a lot of, but like over the last week, it was the weirdest experience for me was seeing the response that came out and the reactions that came out from all of my Asian and Asian American friends, where this was clearly, all the events of the last week were clearly top of mind and the central focus of discussion everywhere. And then there was everyone else. And, you know, they were talking about the latest episode of WandaVision and the Zack Snyder cut and, you know, the NCAA tournament. And it was this really stark example, at least for me, that of invisibility, for one thing, but that there were these two separate discussions going on, at least, you know, in context of my experience. And I don't think I've ever seen that before, honestly. I mean, like, I know having different discussions with different groups of people, but there was such a clear divide this last week, and that was kind of unsettling. So, and that's been a really, you know, important topic of conversation within my family. We've had a lot of discussions in the last few days about that very thing. So, but that's just my experience and I'm on the West Coast, so I don't know if it's any different depending where you are geographically.
Yeah, I guess it says a lot about our bubbles, right? Our various bubbles, and you know, we think it's in the top of the news and top of mind for everybody because we see it in our social media streams, but it's not necessarily so. Derek, how have you been, my friend? I mean, this comes at a career high for you. You have how many projects, you know, in production and development right now? You're juggling like mad, I know. And yet,
yeah, four.
You know.
But yeah, I mean, I have to say that this week has been infuriating to me, actually. And it is actually similar to what Albert has experienced, is that there are two different worlds. We do live in a bubble. I feel like my feed, my social media feed and the people that I engaged in are talking about it in a way that, because a lot of us are socially conscious and a lot of my friends are Asian American. And so these are things that, you know, we think about because we are deeply affected by them, and a lot of people right now are afraid, and my family has reached out to me, and we've reached out to each other and talked about, particularly my elderly family members and my women family members are concerned, and rightfully so, and so for me, this has been very infuriating to me. And whether it is the reaction from, the general public, whether it is, they don't see it as a big deal. And whereas to us, we feel like we're in danger. I feel very similarly to how I felt after the Pulse shootings, because I'm also gay. I identify as LGBTQ. So I feel that sense of fear, and I'm hoping that this will be a rally cry for people to understand that these are issues that are very prevalent and should be paid. We should pay attention to these issues, just as much as any other shooting. I believe that it's race-based. I know a lot of people who don't. I have a lot of thoughts about perceptions of spas and what that means in Asian culture as compared to American culture, and massage and bathhouses and stuff like that. They're very different, have very different contexts in different cultures. So, but yes, I'm feeling all those things. And I'd love to hear how other people are feeling this week.
Yeah. So Cecilia and Marina, as journalists, I'm so curious what it's been like for you in your newsrooms as you actually cover these events. What's going on? What are the conversations around this? Cecilia, do you want to go first?
Sure. So normally in newsrooms, I try to separate my personal life from my professional life. It's a little hard, but we do cover a lot of horrible news. Recently, I broke down. I haven't broken down in a long time about work, and it was covering all these attacks, and it was hurting me very much. And all my friends are in news, so they're posting about it. So I'm on Instagram and I'm seeing the elderly ladies, and also just for context, I had just moved from San Francisco in end of January to New York, to a city that I'm not super familiar with. And now there's all these attacks. So now I feel like in a city that's already too dense or too dangerous for me, it's become even more dangerous because now I have to take the train. I could be attacked from anywhere. There's this really deep-seated fear. And I think also coming from the West Coast, which a lot of the newsrooms have a lot of Asians in it, I'm the only Asian inside the newsroom. At WCBS, we have 3 reporters who are Asian, but because of the pandemic, they don't come into the newsroom. So I am the only Asian voice, and I'm a producer. So I'm behind the scenes. I'm kind of helping with editorial. And so I think I was surprised how much has impacted me on a personal level. And they had put me on a couple like the recent stories where I would be the primary writer for that story with the reporter, with the anchor. And it was really, really hard to go through the raw tapes because we choose when to stop them. We choose when to blur it. So I see all the raw stuff. So I think that's been really hard, but I'm sure we'll get into this later, but I started kind of pitching things that relate to me, and it was the first time that I felt like people really took me seriously because my voice matters at this time.
Yeah. God. What about for you, Marina? Are you going into the newsroom these days? Is it all virtual?
I'm not. Fortunately, as a digital media person, I can work remotely. And so I've been working remotely for, a year plus now. But yeah, to kind of get at your question about what it's been like covering this, I will say I feel very similarly to what Albert and Derek said about there's just a lot of frustration of seeing Asian Americans, we know this. We've been experiencing this not just for the last year, but for our whole lives. And it's been really frustrating to kind of see all of a sudden other people kind of wake up and notice. And for me, I've been covering this for a long time, particularly this wave of racism, but just in general, I've covered issues around Asian American identity for a long time. And so it's frustrating to feel like only now, like, people are really noticing. I think the one positive thing I've noticed is that there still aren't enough of us, but I think there are a lot more Asian American journalists out there telling these stories, not just these moments of fear and trauma and peril and sadness and grief for our communities, but also, joyful stories and stories about resilience and stories that have nothing to do with our identities. So I think that is changing a little bit. Again, it should change more, but that is one thing that I've noticed, especially in the last week or two. I think more than ever before, Asian American journalists are the people really driving the narrative and really, taking the lead on some of these stories. That said, I still think there's a lot of work to be done. I think a really concrete example of this is when people, when the law enforcement in Georgia said this wasn't, or like, we're not sure if it was race-based, and the gunman had a quote unquote sexual addiction. And immediately my first thought was, I'm an Asian woman. I know that as Asian women, we are often hypersexualized and exoticized and fetishized. And you can't divorce race and racism and misogyny from that. And that is something I immediately pointed out to people in my newsroom. And I noticed in a lot of news coverage, that was not a point that was made. And, I'm sure that has a lot to do with the fact that there's still not enough Asian American journalists in newsrooms. And I just, it was very frustrating to see people kind of take the law enforcement explanation at face value and not interrogate it at all, and not really challenge it in any way, and point out that there is this long, long, long history of Asian women being hypersexualized. And so that was really frustrating. I do think some of it is changing slowly but surely, but that's something that's a clear area where there's a lot more work to be done.
Yeah. So, fear, frustration, we're feeling all of those things. Everyone here is a professional storyteller, right? We entered our lines of work because we wanted to, tell our truths. And yet we are Asian Americans working in mostly white spaces. What has that meant for you in your careers? What struggles, if any, have you had in your work? What pushback have you had in trying to, to cover or, develop or otherwise tell your stories? Maybe Cecilia, if you could start, local news. You work mostly in the local news, is that right? And also national broadcast news too, still skews heavily toward a white audience. And even though the demographic data doesn't necessarily uphold that, right? I mean, the viewership can be extremely diverse. What is that like in the newsroom in trying to get stories about Asians or any minorities covered?
I think this was especially frustrating when I was working in San Francisco, being that the city itself is 30% Asian. So before this rash of attacks, like everyone has said, this has been happening. And in the Bay Area, it mostly was happening to the elderly. And so it would happen in Chinatown, and our station in San Francisco was not far from Chinatown. And so I would push these stories, and the management was mostly white, and they would just kind of like, oh yeah, that's bad. But then eventually like forget about it. And at the time it was, and this is not to say that this is the wrong decision. I had to kind of push for it, that this is the last year during George Floyd. So anything that had to do with African-American racism or any anti-African-American issues, we jumped on it immediately. But when it came to Asian issues and I would push for it, they wouldn't give it any attention. And then I had to kind of sit down with management, and I was like, hey, I know that there's not big rallies, and now there are this year, but for the most part, for the longest time, it was quiet. Most Asians just don't want to be in the public. When we went to Chinatown, they wouldn't talk to reporters. So that's partly why they were hesitant to assign that story. But it was really painful to see that we care so much more. Not that we care so much more for one race over the other, but it's just not equal attention because it wasn't trendy yet. And then now it's become more and more that now we're paying attention. Everyone is reaching out to me and asking me how I feel. And it's this like kind of mixture of anger and frustration. I was like, this has been happening so long. And I've been pushing these stories for so long, and it's only now that I'm getting heard, which I'm happy about, but also it's like a little too late. And there's right recently, I guess in the Bay Area, there's this new challenge called Slap the Asian Challenge. And there's groups, apparently, I've been seeing my friends say that there's a group of 9 to 10 people who go into public transportation in the Bay Area and they'll just slap the Asians. And I just feel like there's this huge disrespect that Asians cannot stand up for themselves, that you can do whatever you want to them. And it makes me so sad.
To actually dovetail that, the jokes after the shooting in Atlanta about happy endings and all of that type of stuff was very prominent, making light of and sexualizing, obviously, Asian women. And, the jokes were, it's very similar to what people are saying with Slap the Asian. These are things that people take lightly, and only until we speak up and say this is not acceptable is when people will actually pay attention.
Yeah, I just want to jump in for a second and just to be clear, there was very little coverage of our Black citizen struggles either before George Floyd. So right, but it's as though there's a tiny little portion of the pie for the minority coverage, right? And they can't share any more than what they have. Derek, I want to go back to you. Like, what is it like as a filmmaker? Is it in general harder to get Asian-centered stories financed? Like, and can you talk about adapting your film, The Housemaid, right now, which is when your original film, which you wrote and directed, was set very much in a Vietnamese culture, and you've changed that for the American adaptation.
Yeah, I mean, yes, it's very difficult to, particularly Asian American stories. I think that there are some times when Hollywood is interested in Asian stories, like in Asia, but don't, really pay attention to Asian American stories or Asian diasporic stories. I think that's changing. It's starting to change. I think that, in the indie world, Asian Americans have been making films for many, many years, decades. And so only until recently have, people, the greenlighters have been able to pay attention because of recent successes, And I actually feel optimistic, that diverse storytelling in the Asian American or Asian diasporic, storytelling world is starting to get more funded, and things are, you can actually get into the door and get the interview, right? Whereas back in the day when I started writing and working in the film, I'd get meetings with all the studios, and they say, oh, we really love your writing, but we can't cast this. We can't, you have Asian American leads, and so I was disheartened and decided to collectively bring together other Asian American filmmakers to create our own way of making films, and because we can no longer rely on primarily white straight males to take us seriously and take our stories and understand that our stories. Sorry?
Not that you ever could.
but so now once we've been able to make films on our own terms, then I think that this, I feel, is an Asian American renaissance. Hopefully, I'm hoping that it's going to continue. Not only in films, but in television and in storytelling. And I mean, web content, the web is actually where a lot of Asian Americans first started, like on YouTube, and because they didn't need permission, and people realize that there is an audience for people, and you didn't have to have those gatekeepers to bless you,
Yeah, no, that's huge. Albert, I had a long and illustrious career in journalism before you turned to TV, and I know you've had interesting experiences in both spaces. But can you talk to us about some of maybe I know, because I've heard from you, you've had some really interesting experiences in pitching and developing Asian-centered shows. Is that something you could talk about?
Yeah, I mean, first I just wanted to say, like, hearing some of Cecilia's experiences is really disheartening, because it's been a long time since I was a journalist. And it's a little disappointing to hear that things haven't changed a whole lot, because a lot of those stories sound very familiar to me. It was very often in my career that I was the only Asian person in a news organization or in a meeting, an editorial meeting. And I began my journalism career in 19. I guess that joke doesn't work when it starts with a 19, but it's been a long time, and it's sad to hear that things haven't wholly changed. But I still remember very clearly at one magazine, I was told that we needed to bring our diversity numbers up. So I was asked to hire some more minorities, and I did. And I had several candidates, most of whom were Asian American, and then was subsequently told they weren't the right kind of minorities, right? They didn't count. And it goes to this idea that largely in this country, diversity often breaks down into this binary conversation, right? And it's not to say, like you said, Lisa, that we're supposed to be discounting the experiences of African Americans and Latinx people here, but like Asians often, as we all know, end up being kind of not counted in either column, and we end up being invisible. And and that's applied as well in my transition to Hollywood, because the only time I haven't been the only Asian in a writer's room is when I've hired someone else. That's the only other time that I haven't been the only Asian person in the room. As far as development goes, it's been an interesting, I would say, couple of years, because I think about a few years ago there was a shift in priorities and a seemingly new openness among Hollywood studios to telling more diverse kinds of stories, and stories with different kinds of leads and characters, and that was great. But it's a multi-dimensional problem. It doesn't stop at one part of the process, and I think it's interesting. I think, Lisa, you and I were having coffee or lunch the day that we both sold pitches, both stories centered around Asian American characters, and it was either the day before the day that Crazy Rich Asians opened. Yeah. And I remember that being something we both used in our pitches, and it was great, and we both sold it. Now, after that, it became interesting, because I found that studios and networks are willing to say they're committed to telling different kinds of stories, but what ended up happening a lot of times is they're really looking to tell kind of the same kinds of stories, just fronted by non-white actors. And there's a big difference there. Being committed to diverse stories about the Asian and Asian American experience, means being committed to seeing characters that may not act the way you expect them to act, or to have emotional responses that are different from what you're comfortable with. It's one of the most remarkable things I experienced while I was watching Minari, because I loved it. It was an incredible movie. And as I watched it, just because of my occupation, I kept hearing the studio notes in my head. I kept hearing like executives telling me like, why isn't the wife more vocal? She should stand up for herself, because I've gotten those notes, right? And telling executives that a character from a different culture might react differently than what they're used to tends to go over their heads. So all of which is say, it's like, it's not as simple as just getting studios or networks to say, okay, we'll buy more of these projects. It's also getting to realize they're going to be different kinds of stories. They're going to be different kinds of characters. It's not just cosmetic changes. And it points to another problem because, we talk a lot about the need for more Asian actors and writers and directors, which is absolutely essential, but we also need people in those crucial decision-making executive roles, which there are very few of, and so we need executives in those ranks that'll understand what it's like for these characters and these kinds of stories. And so it's like I said, it's a multi-pronged problem, and it's going to be sort of slow going as we go through. The good news is I do think we're starting to see changes. We're starting to see this willingness to change. Shows and stories like Minari and all of these are making a difference. But unfortunately, Hollywood is a very slow moving ship. You turn the wheel and it takes a few years before it actually, the ship corrects course. And then you just hope you don't end up like the ship stuck in the Suez Canal. But it's that kind of process that we're in right now, I think.
Yeah.
I think.
Sorry, go ahead. Don't go ahead.
I just identify a lot with what Albert was saying, and I think that a lot of times Hollywood thinks that like films like Crazy Rich Asians or Minari are just a fluke, and it has to be. In fact, in order for it to have real change, it has to be consistent, right? And because everything there, decisions are made by metrics and money and box office and all of those type of things. But if Asian American films are happening once every 2 years or once every 3 years, I mean, how are you going to measure those metrics? And giving those opportunities, and it's absolutely about gatekeepers, and having Asian Americans in those positions in which they could greenlight, and we are constantly seeing Asian American stereotypes, particularly of Asian American women or Asian women. And if there was an Asian woman at the head of the studio, I know for damn sure that wouldn't happen, And so, yes, I was just agreeing with him.
I was also having this is slightly tangential, but I remember having this conversation with another Asian American writer, producer, and we were just talking about that show, Bling Empire. And she was like, oh, God, this is having a cheesy reality show out there. I don't think it's really good. And I'm like, I don't mind it. I don't mind that because if you look at the gamut of programming and stories that are out there for the mainstream white audience, it's a bell curve, right? There's like your prestige dramas and really high-end, critically acclaimed shows. You got your sort of crappy reality shows on the other end and the vast middle in between, right? It's like, until we have that whole bell curve, I don't care. Fill it all out. Like we should have our cheesy reality shows and our high-end shows and our in-between commercial successes. So there should be room for Crazy Rich Asians and Minari and Parasite and everything, And so until we get that, bring it on. I don't want to say we need to gatekeep and say we can only do the best kinds of prestige dramas, and that's the only way we're going to break through. But that again, and it was an interesting conversation because it was with another Asian American writer producer who had a different take on all of that.
Yeah. Marina, I want to get to you too. What about you? What was it like, for instance, as an Asian covering the 2016 elections?
Oh, got a lot of war stories about that. First, I wanted to say that some of the problems that Derek and Albert described about Hollywood are very similar in journalism and in newsrooms. And I'm sure in every single industry where, Asian Americans and I think, people of color in general are underrepresented. I'm sure, to my previous point, I'm sure that if we had more Asian American editors, Asian American executives, we would have a lot more coverage of the issues we're talking about. We would have better coverage of the issues that we're talking about, more nuanced coverage. And also, if you're hiring Asian American journalists or journalists of color in general, any journalists from marginalized communities, you have to give them room to grow. Too often, what we see is people get hired at the bottom. They might get hired as an intern or as through some kind of diversity fellowship or some kind of thing. And this is true in Hollywood as well. And they don't get to move up. They stay at the bottom they don't get to move into roles where they have power to shape the stories that are being told and shape the coverage. And often they are tokenized and forced to kind of figure out this lane where they can cover the stories that they want to cover, but then, may often have to be put on, stories based on maybe they're the only Asian reporter and they have to cover the stories about Asians because they're the only person that can do that. I'm not saying that's my experience, but I think in general, that is something that happens a lot to journalists. For me, I mean, I've had a lot, to answer your question, Lisa, about 2016, but also kind of just generally talking about my career, I started covering politics. As you can imagine, it was very draining covering that election, covering an openly racist president for 4 years. And I think that's true for so many journalists. That was incredibly draining, especially journalists of color and female journalists. It did teach me, though, that I could define pick my lane and really just try to do the stories I wanted to do. I was a breaking news reporter for a long time, so that there were certain stories that I had to cover because they're just, the news was happening at a very rapid pace, particularly during the Trump presidency. So there were stories that I had to cover, but then I tried to figure out how I could find stories to tell that other people weren't telling. And sometimes that had to do with Asian American identity, and sometimes that didn't. And I really kind of got to a point gradually. I mean, to be honest, it took me a long time to kind of build that confidence. And I think it takes a long time sometimes, especially when you're a woman of color, to kind of build that confidence and figure out your lane. But eventually I did. And my current area of coverage is something that kind of came out of all of those experiences of trying to navigate, how do I cover politics? How do I cover culture? How do I embrace being an Asian American journalist and all of, what my identity brings to the table, but also not be defined by that, because that often happens in, I think, all of our industries and in all of our work. So it was a real journey to figure that out and to navigate that. But it did, I do, I do feel like I get to cover the stories I want to cover now, but it's hard. It's really hard. You have to figure that out for yourself. And sometimes it takes a lot of just maneuvering and picking up extra work, and there's just not enough time sometimes. One thing that I wanted to say earlier was that I think, kind of related to Cecilia's point about how sometimes you get pushback for covering stories about Asian Americans, and sometimes there's just no time because whatever your role is, you have to just, you have to cover. If you're a breaking news reporter, you have to cover the breaking news. If you're a, elections reporter, you have to cover the campaign trail. Or if you're a finance reporter, you have to cover finance. And sometimes there's just not enough time to cover the stories that aren't being covered enough. And I think this is really magnified by the fact that our industry is very unstable financially right now. I work at HuffPost. We had layoffs 2 weeks ago. 47 of my colleagues lost their jobs. This has been happening in a lot of places across digital media and just in journalism in general. Every time you have a big layoff like that, you lose so many people who could have been covering all of these stories. And you have to do a lot more with less. And inevitably, some stories that you could have been covering, you won't get to cover anymore because you have to kind of focus on whatever the priorities are or whatever the mandate is. And too often, what gets left behind are stories about Asian Americans or communities of color in general, or marginalized communities. And so that's something that I really worry about.
Right. So those stories aren't considered the sort of the essential workers of the what we put out in media, right? The necessary stories. I want to remind the viewers that if you have any questions for our guests, please put them in the chat or in the Q&A. We'll try to get to them. I think, the hope in doing a program like this is that we're reaching out to folks. Hopefully it's not just a bunch of Asians out there, although, hello, if you are, we're very happy to see you. But we don't want to just preach to the choir. We're hoping to reach out to our brothers and sisters in our industries who care and who want to do better. So let's talk a little bit about what we'd like to see changed. Let's talk stereotypes, right? So this week, Jay Leno finally apologized for his years of jokes about Asians eating dog meat, right? His explanation, there's always an explanation, was, well, there's some truth to it, and also it's a joke, right? So what stereotypes are your pet peeves, or maybe are some that our non-Asian colleagues might not realize are harmful? I'd like to start with this one. It's the stereotype in TV and film that Asian women are cold and uptight. The note that I got about an Asian female lead in a project is that she's strident, right? She's not strident, she's ambitious, So what for you guys is a stereotype that you'd like to see go away?
Gosh, there's so many. I mean, the first one that comes to mind because of the shootings is, portraying Asian women as weak and submissive and prostitutes, that they're defenseless, that they need protecting, that, it perpetuates this idea that people need to, that men see them as vulnerable and can easily be taken advantage of, that stereotype is, I still think is pretty prevalent, when I was alluding to this earlier is that, the idea of spas and, bathhouses in Asia, that's an everyday thing. This is like a cultural family tradition in many, many Asian cultures. Whereas here, a lot of times it's associated with sex work, and that's where when I saw that there was a shooting, I already saw that cultural disconnect, and so the fact that he says that the killer says that he has a sexual addiction after killing 6 Asian women and 2 other people, speaks volumes about how people, particularly men of white men, perceive Asian women, and how that triggers this guy to start shooting. To me, that says volumes, so that stereotype can be gone forever.
Yeah, the flip side of that is that if Asian women aren't submissive and supporting, Asian women who want power or ambitious are always the villain. They end up, it's the dragon lady trope. I mean, that's the flip side of it. Like, the overly ambitious, scary, and villainous dragon lady. There was, I probably shouldn't even get into this, but like there was a, very successful premium cable program last year that was really widely celebrated and rightly so, and I loved it as well. I thought it was great. It was incredibly complex storytelling, complex topic, but in the final episode of that show, it completely copped out, because the big reveal was that the bad guy wasn't the white people you thought it was, who were literally white supremacists, right? It was the successful, smart, ambitious Asian American woman. It was just another example of that dragon lady trope. And I'm not saying that Asians can't be the bad guy in any story. But this happened to be a show that deliberately put a lens on racial conflict, and in the end decided that those dynamics were only really about black and white. And again, it goes to this idea that the Asians were kind of rendered invisible. And I know how hard, working in the industry, I know how hard it is with these stories and coming to a satisfying conclusion. And so I'm not trying to put down the creators of that show at all, but like, you know, I just wonder how, if they would had gotten to the same conclusion if there were an Asian writer in the room. You know, it's sometimes you need that sensitivity to those kinds of stereotypes, which others aren't, because it is complex and complicated to explain to people. Like, you don't want sexually submissive women, you don't want overly ambitious women, and like there's a whole spectrum in between that often doesn't get portrayed.
I think the two that so to your Albert's point really quickly about the Bling Empire, I actually liked it because I want to show that there are such a wide variety of Asians. And when I grew up in Atlanta, there was like the model Asian. It's like the stereotypical nerdy, you know, good Asian. And then when I went to LA and my parents enrolled me into a 60% Asian high school, I had a culture shock because you got the skater Asian, you got all the stereotypes across the board. You got the Asians who are bad at school, you got the Asians who are really good at school. Like it was all. And so when I saw Bling Empire, I'm like, yes, like we need the kind of like the cheesy, like trashy, like it just gives us more that dimension. And so the two stereotypes I hate is also the comical side character, which I'm seeing more and more of. Yesterday I watched on Netflix Yes Day, and the one Asian character in it is the crazy lady who's trying to fight the mom to get win this gorilla at an arcade. And it's always kind of just like a quirky side character. He's the comical, like supporting role. And I was like, why can't we ever be like the Yes Day mom, you know? And then the other one is the model Asian. I think Ken Jeong had also used it in his like stand-up just to kind of poke fun, like, oh, I was like the model Asian, I was a great doctor. And I think people use that semi-jokingly now, like in some of my newsrooms where they're like, oh, like so-and-so is the model Asian reporter, you know, like he or she does like everything right, never complains. Like, and I think to a certain extent, when people say that, it makes me a little like, there's pressure, like, oh, am I supposed to act a certain way? Like, am I supposed to be the good Asian? So those are my two stereotypes that I feel like should go as well.
I really like all of these. I agree with all of them. One additional one that came to mind, I think from my experience covering politics, is that this idea that like Asian Americans are apolitical and like don't participate in politics and aren't civically engaged and don't vote and don't go to protests, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I think increasingly we've seen that is not true at all, especially this past election where Asian Americans, especially in Georgia, were crucial to Biden winning the election. And you cannot take Asian American votes for granted for either party, to be honest. And that I hope that stereotype is starting to go away, as I think we are really more than ever before, I think really asserting our political power. And, you know, hopefully this moment will galvanize even more people across different Asian American communities to really assert their power. And I think the protests are really encouraging. So I do think that's changing a little bit, but it is something, again, it is historically rooted, this idea that we are silent and we don't speak up and we try not to make waves or cause a fuss. And then some of that comes, I mean, it comes from a lot of different places. But I think, you know, hopefully that's starting to change.
Well, we have an Asian American vice president now.
I mean, yeah, that
you know,
that is a big, yeah.
I got some questions coming in. I want to make sure we get to them. There are remaining 9 minutes. Amy asks, I've been told by a supervisor that I am every old white man's fantasy. Ew, and told my eyes look slanty. Oh, I'm sorry. When I spoke up, I was labeled difficult and drama. What advice do you have to deal with issues like this without being labeled difficult and drama?
I'll answer that really quickly because I have coworkers. Being in the newsroom, there are a lot of older men and they can say creepy things. And I think that now there's such an emphasis on sexual harassment training that it teaches you exactly what you should be doing. And you don't have to, if you don't feel comfortable, directly respond to the person who's making these comments. You can go to HR, you can go to a different manager, and they will take care of it. And in light of what's happening right now, I think everyone's hyper careful. And I don't think you're going to have the same kind of negative reaction to reporting it.
Yeah, that's a great answer. Anyone else want to weigh in on that? I'm going to move on to next question. What coverage have you seen that has been inspiring for you in the past year? For example, 75-year-old Xiao Zhenxie, who beat back her attacker after being sucker punched in the eye while waiting for a traffic light in downtown San Francisco.
Are they talking about coverage or just the story? I mean, that was a great story. I love the outcome of that story. Or are they talking about the news coverage of incidents? Do you know?
I do not know. So just take that for what it's worth. I mean, well, let's start with stories. What stories inspired you? Were there acts of bravery or courage? Maybe the journalists, did you cover something that you felt was a great story this past year?
I mean, I'm not a journalist, but I thought that Kamala Harris was inspiring. I think that she's very inspiring. I think that she's second in charge. And I think I often complain about how there are times when Asians aren't vocal enough or supportive enough of, let's say, Black Lives Matters, the movement, and I actually feel that there were a lot of Asian Americans that were very supportive of the Black Lives Matters movement. But at the same time, this is an example of how she is an example of how all of our identities are coming together. And she is the cross section of America in many, many ways. So to me, that's inspiring that she actually was voted legitimately to to her office. And so I think that will speak volumes to many young people nowadays. And that there isn't. We've been taught there's such a glass ceiling. Hopefully that will shatter, and that has shattered with her.
Yeah.
So often the stories.
She I think one thing that was really inspiring and noteworthy was that she was able to talk about all of those identities on the campaign trail in ways that I think historically politicians of color, female politicians, it's hard to talk about race and gender in a way that doesn't box you in or open you up to criticism. And there's this real juggling act that a lot of politicians have to do, and queer politicians too. Basically anyone from a marginalized community, when they're running for office, they have this juggling act of how much of their identity can they talk about, and they have all of these different things they have to navigate. And I think she more so than I think other politicians in the past was able to just talk frankly about all of those different identities, all the different groups that she comes from.
Yeah, thank you, Sung-Soo. Luther Mace asks, how can we as storytellers bridge the divide when minority communities, within minority communities, so that we understand that we're in this fight together? As minorities, we tend to see and experience through the lens of our own tribes and not see the connections between us. Hate against Asians is no different than hate against Blacks, Muslims, Latinx, and Jews. The source of the hate is the same. It's just manifesting through a particular group at a particular time. So how can we, again, as storytellers, bridge the divide between the communities?
I could talk a bit about this because it's something I think about in my coverage a lot as a journalist. I think one thing that's important is to always remind people of the historical context. There is a long history of solidarity across racial groups in social justice movements. There's a long history of Asian Black solidarity, for example, that dates back to the civil rights movement and student protests in the 1960s. And that's, if you're a journalist writing a story about current protests, that's something that you can bring in, or you could even do a story about that history. I think, Derek mentioned a lot of Asian Americans marched in Black Lives Matter protests last summer. And that was a really inspiring moment of again, it's tied to that history, but also a product of this current moment of, I think, everyone being really aware that, you know, racism and white supremacy, these are all things that are intertwined, and, you know, we're all in this fight together.
Yeah.
So that's something that, you know, the more you can point that out, if you're a journalist or, you know, whatever kind of stories you tell, the more you can point that out, you know, is really important, because a lot of people aren't aware of that history.
Yeah.
And the other thing I would say is it's important to kind of untangle, you know, don't be afraid to kind of get to some of the complexities. Last year I did a story about anti-Blackness in Asian communities, and, you know, I'm sure many of you know that there's a long history of that. And I talked to a lot of fellow Asian Americans who are confronting this in their families and having to call out their family members for saying racist things. And again, like, anytime you can point that out, I think is a really good way of getting to the heart of these issues.
Yeah.
Another thing I just thought of back, which, sorry, my brain is very scattered today. But another thing, speaking of historical context, when we talk about the model minority stereotype, for example, that has been traditionally used to drive a wedge between us and other racial groups. And that's a product of racism and white supremacy. That is a tool that white politicians use against us and against other groups of color. So that, like, when you are writing about that or talking about that or using that concept, it's imperative for you to point that out. So I think anytime when you can point out that all of these things stem from racism and white supremacy, that's a moment where you can kind of bridge those differences. And again, like, I don't think there are as many differences as we perceive.
Yeah, this is a
Lisa,
great answer. I wanted, sorry, Derek, I want to
Okay.
make sure we have, we can get to these other questions, because I think they're important, and we are at the 8 o'clock Eastern time mark now. If you guys can hang out for a few more minutes longer and get to these, we'd love to address them. Adrita Mukherjee asks, and maybe this is a question for Albert, can you discuss how you approach the balance between telling identity-focused stories that you have the right background to tell versus stories you want to tell that are not just identity-focused? Are execs open to the latter?
They're getting to be. It's like I said before, it's a kind of a process. Hollywood is a tricky place because there are gatekeepers, and so it's a constantly evolving situation where, and the only real solution is to sort of just keep pushing at the gatekeepers and making sure to do all the things we talked about earlier, is like making sure that you're avoiding stereotypes and tropes in terms of the characters, and trying to center Asians and Asian stories, you know, rather than, if you're going to tell a story set in, you know, feudal Japan, put some Japanese people in it rather than Tom Cruise. You know, it's that kind of stuff that you got to do. But like, sorry, repeat the part about the identity issues there.
I think the question is, you know, if you want to tell identity-focused stories that you have the right background to tell versus stories you want to tell that aren't just identity-focused. If you're an Indian American, do you have to tell a story about your Indian American, you know, grandpa who immigrated over on the whatever? Can't it just be about a guy who likes basketball?
Yeah, now it's a big topic of conversation these days in Hollywood. It's like, who can tell what story, right? And to me, it comes down to really a question of opportunity, right? It's like, no one is denying that writers can tell different stories from different points of view. That's the whole point of writing, right? Being able to inhabit these other characters. The thing that historically has happened, though, is that white storytellers have had a monopoly on all the stories, right? So when you start to say things like, well, maybe an Asian storyteller can tell this story about the Chinese or Japanese story they want to do, and then all of a sudden there's pushback against a white writer writing that same story, there's a lot of, they start to bristle. It's like, well, I should be able to tell whatever story I want to tell. Sure, yes, you are. But like historically, you've taken that opportunity away from someone else who also wants to be able to tell that story. So it's about making sure that the balance of opportunity is correct. Now, if you're also in a room telling stories involving multiple points of view and cultural backgrounds. Again, I think it's important to have, you know, a fair representation in that room of those points of view and backgrounds. So like making sure you have people who will note if something feels awkward or uncomfortable or wrong. So it's a combination of tactics that I think is involved there.
Yeah. I don't want to keep everyone for too long. I know we all have families to get back to, or good TV shows or dessert. But maybe we can end on this one because it's a little uplifting. From Camilla Rubis, as a scripted TV writer, other than more representation and dimensionality, what are your thoughts on positive messaging we can put out there about Asian people to non-Asian audiences? Maybe, you know, not just for scripted TV, but in film and in journalism. What are our thoughts on that?
I'd love to see, like, you know, Asian and African American stories that have no context with white people. You know, like it would be great to like have narratives that are inclusive of other people of color. You know, oftentimes we are told that it's either, you know, we have to tell our stories and then our stories in context with white people. You know, how about we talk about ourselves and bring it in the perspective of other people of color, you know, in these worlds, because it exists, you know, and it's often not seen, you know, and so for me, I think that might be a way, you know.
Yeah, I think there was Gabrielle Union, I think, is starring in the new Cheaper by the Dozen, and I think Jason, what's his name, Arrested Development, not Jason Bluth.
Yes.
But like, why couldn't that be Steve Yoon? Why couldn't that be John Cho? Right? Mixed race does not mean one side is white. It can mean, you know, that the races get to mix. Anybody else? Any thoughts on that to close?
I think in journalism, I think, you know, just telling Asian stories every day, not just when there's a big news story that happens to be about Asian Americans, not just when things are terrible, but when, you know, things are, I mean, nothing's ever fine, I guess, but like, you know, things that where like an Asian American happens to be the newsmaker, but they're not talking about being Asian American. Or, you know, I read a lot about movies and television as a cultural reporter, and I try to, you know, spotlight Asian American talent, but I also want to write about other things. And so just giving journalists the opportunity, I think similar to what Derek and Albert were saying about, you know, film and television, just allowing us to tell whatever stories we want and allowing, you know, maximum opportunity is the goal, I think, for everybody.
Yeah. Well, thank you all very, very much. I see in the chat that there's a lot of comments from our wonderful members who have attended, and many of you are not Asian, and that gives me great hope too that this is a topic that that people do care about and will continue to care about, and hopefully we'll be able to all together effect some change. So thank you once again for joining us. Thank you to our wonderful panelists, and hopefully we'll see you again soon. Stay safe.